Hi, I'm Lynn O'Shaughnessy, and I want to thank you for listening to this presentation today we're going to talk about SAT and ACT test optional schools. A lot has been going on with them, and I have someone who has been an expert in this. He's done a lot of research when he was getting his PhD on test optionals, which his research blew my mind about it because it was kind of different than what the traditional conventional wisdom said about that, which I love when you actually get to what's really going on. So this is Andrew Belasco. He's a CEO of College Transitions, which is a national college admissions firm. They're based in Georgia, but they have clients all over. He also has just written published a book called, let's see, Colleges
Worth your
Wait,
money.
College is Worth Your Money. I don't know why I can't remember that. I
No worries.
actually endorsed the
That's
book.
right.
I
Thank you,
read
Lynn.
the book. So,
Yeah.
and then he also, which is a great book. You should get it. You can get it on Amazon. And then Enlightened College Applicant is his previous book, which is a general guide to college admissions, whereas his newest book has dozens and dozens of data points on about 150 colleges and goes far more in depth about specific colleges than most, if not all, books. So I think you guys should check it out. So anyway, Andrew, I thought of him, I thought of you because of this crazy stuff going on with test optionals, and it seemed like almost for a while every day I was getting an email about another school that was going test optional, and some schools I was just like, wow, I'm really surprised they're going test optional. Some of the most elite colleges
Right.
were
Right.
going test optional. So maybe Andrew, you could start by, just for people who aren't familiar really with what does this mean, what is a test optional policies that colleges have?
Yeah, it's a policy that allows students to submit their applications without reporting their standardized test scores. So without reporting their SAT or ACT results or any other exams like subject test scores. So essentially, as a test optional applicant, you're evaluated on the basis of your other credentials. Those could be things like the rigor of your coursework, your grades, the strength of your extracurricular profile, other things like that. So again, it gives low scoring and otherwise qualified applicants an opportunity to really be closely considered, especially at very selective institutions.
Mm-hmm. Now, one thing it isn't is if your test scores aren't great, but then your grades aren't really commensurate with what the applicants of that school has. It's not going to be magical, right?
No, it's not a cure-all. And we tell our students this all the time. So, when you're thinking about going test optional, you really need to ask yourself a couple questions. Are my standardized test scores above or below those of the average incoming student? Are my grades above those or below those of the average incoming student? Is there something about my applicant profile that really helps me stand out from other applicants? I think generally speaking, if your test scores are lower than average, fall outside of that middle range, but your grades are relatively impressive, it's probably good to consider going test optional.
Mm-hmm. Do you know, I think I've seen this before, what the typical student who does not turn their test scores in typically are, this could have been a while ago, about 150 points lower than what other students who did turn their test scores in at a particular school
Yeah,
earned?
I think it varies. I've seen a number of different reports. I think it definitely varies considerably by institution. So for instance, if you're looking, at the University of Chicago, that just, implemented a test optional policy because those average standardized test results are so incredibly high, it's possible that students not submitting their test scores could even have a lower standardized test result, lower than 150 points below average. So again, it really can help applicants who shined in many, many different areas, but just are not good test takers or have not done well on those exams.
Right. And do you think, sometimes I think it can be hard for students to determine, gosh, should I turn my test scores in or not? And sometimes I just tell them, hey, just ask the admission rep. Like they will know if you should turn it in or
Absolutely. Yes, I mean, you should take advantage of the information you already have access to. Admissions reps are very anxious, very willing to help people. They want to draw more applicants to their institutions, so they're willing to provide as much information as possible. And we encourage our students to do this. They get on the phone or they send an email and say, hey, listen, here's my profile. What do you think? They may not give specific personalized recommendation, but they might say something like, in general, when we see students with average SAT scores 200 points lower than average, many of them do go test optional. So that's not, out of bounds. It's a fair question. So absolutely, it's a good idea.
And I guess one thing that I would caution people about, they're going to go test optional. And I wrote about this, oh my gosh, over a decade ago for the New York Times about this, and the upside and downside of test optional, right? Was, some schools will reserve their best merit scholarships to students who actually did submit the SAT or ACT. Even though in my experience back then, most schools, you're going to get merit scholarships if you don't submit it. But I think it's worthwhile asking a school, and I don't know, what is your experience with that?
It's a really, really important consideration. Aside from your academic credentials, there are a number of test optional institutions that still award scholarships on the basis of test performance. American University, Dickinson College, Furman University, are just a few of the many test optional schools that still consider test performance, when doling out money. So it's also why we encourage all of our students to devote sufficient time and effort to prepping for their standardized exams, regardless of whether or not they actually submit their scores, because, if they're not even trying, they may be leaving a lot of money on the table at the end of the day.
Right. So once again, I think it'd be best to contact the admission office of a school and say, would I still get merit aid, or would I be considered for all merit scholarships? And
that's right.
When I queried, and way back then, I called over 36 colleges that were test optional, and none of them said that their financial need-based aid would be affected. But I just can't help but believe that it wouldn't be affected.
Yeah, it more, I think, so than need-based aid, definitely merit-based aid. There's a lot of incentive to lure high-scoring students to campus, right? Because if you do, your average standardized test result that you report to US News, college guides, other ranking systems goes up as a result. So absolutely, there is an incentive for students, for colleges to grab those types of students. So you're going to see a lot of these institutions offer good sums of merit-based money for high scorers. Another reason, again, to consider taking those exams.
Right. Now, okay, so Andrew, I wanted to get into what your research showed.
Sure.
In terms of what about test optional, because publicly colleges always present this as this is the right thing to do, right? And it is the right thing to do
for a lot of reasons.
There's a lot of cynical reasons why colleges do this too, that's why I loved your research, that you could actually say, yeah, this is what we discovered. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So several years ago, two other colleagues at the University of Georgia and myself published a paper which incorporated a quasi-experimental technique. It was called difference in differences modeling, to examine whether test optional policies, particularly at liberal arts colleges, improved economic and racial diversity on campus. And we discovered that actually, no, these policies did not have a significant impact in the way of improving diversity on average.
And that was what schools said, the reason they were doing it.
There are a lot of schools do come out, especially when they first implement these policies, say we're really doing this primarily because we want to improve diversity on campus. We want to attract more disadvantaged and or underrepresented students. So it's not what we found within this subset of institutions, specifically liberal arts colleges. It's not to say that we wouldn't find a different relationship, different effects if we analyzed research universities, for example. The different types of students go to different types of institutions. So we want to be very careful, when we talk about our study, that it isn't necessarily generalizable to all types of institutions. So we didn't find an impact on diversity, but we did discover that going test optional improved the perceived selectivity of these institutions because they led to a rise in application numbers, and they also inflated a school's average standardized test score because low scoring applicants were able to enroll without submitting their test results. So benefits appeared to be more institution serving than student serving.
Right, which is kind of mind blowing in a way.
It is. We were surprised as well by what we found.
Yes. In fact, when I did this, article for the New York Times way back when, I talked to an enrollment or a guy who was one of the consultants at a big, enrollment management firm who had done a study about all this. And he just said, yeah, if you get these, admissions guys, you drink a few beers, they're going to admit like all these reasons why they're going test.
Right.
Which is one reason, just one of many reasons why I'm so cynical about the higher ed world, because it's like, oh my gosh,
Yeah, and it's not to discount the genuine reasons why people do go test optional. There's great reasons, to consider a test optional policy. I mean, you have a lot of really talented students out there that just are not good test takers, but would really thrive at some of these selected institutions. So that could be a reason, but be transparent about it. I think that's fine. And also, it's not so bad to say that, hey, there are things that benefit our institution, as a result of implementing these policies. We understand, it's not just about serving students. They're an institution. They have to survive. They have to thrive. So I don't think that should be a secret.
Right. But I think it is. Colleges never talk about like, hey, most colleges are struggling to get enough students every year, right? Inside a higher ed Gallup survey every year of college admission officials, say what 2/3 of colleges, private and state, are not meeting their freshman enrollment. So one way to increase it is to go test optional, because all the people who go, oh, I never thought I could get into University of Chicago, or, Amherst now, or, David's, all these schools that you're like, Skidmore, like, wow, I
have a shot.
Now I have a shot at it. So what does that do? It just brings so many more applications in, and they can't take them all, right? So they can reject more kids. So they look even more exclusive, which,
that's right.
Kids who are looking at elite schools like that.
Of course.
Really. And so does US News and World Report. They love that. The more you can reject, the better, they like you, which is a sick thing, but that's.
Yeah, no, I mean, inflated standardized test scores, lower acceptance rates, these things impact, rankings. Now, US News did, and other ranking systems did make some adjustments to counteract, I think, the bump that colleges may gain from going test optional. In particular, I think US News discounted the value assigned to the variable, which measures test performance of that test optional school. But higher average test scores can still impact a number of other variables, like the perceived reputation of a college. So a college's peer score, which is actually favored very heavily into the US News methodology. So, going test optional can still have a positive impact on a school's ranking, even if the variable for average test score isn't affected.
Right. And it is incredible how some schools you could have a very large percentage of students not turning in their test scores.
Right.
And if and schools could go, okay, once you've accepted all those kids, the test optional kids, you could ask them, hey, you're in. Now we want to know what your test scores are. We want to see what the test scores of all the kids in the freshman class. And very few schools, and then use that in their published.
Right. It's a responsible way, I think, of going test optional.
Hardly anybody does that. I mean, I don't know if they're still doing it, but I know years ago, Muhlenberg College and Providence College did that. I don't know if they still do, but they were definitely in the minority for sure.
Yeah, and there's been a slight movement in that direction, which is positive, but by no means are all institutions asking applicants to do that. For sure.
Right. So what do you make of what's going on today in terms of test optional and the acceleration? Do you talk about that?
Yeah, I think given the situation we're in right now, I really do believe that a lot of these colleges going test optional are trying to do the right thing. Many of the students won't have the opportunity to take an SAT or ACT before applying to college this fall. And even if they are, virtual exam offerings made available this fall, a lot of these students will be forced to take those exams in unfavorable conditions without adequate access to technology. So I do think that college is moving away from test requirements, especially for this fall, are probably making a good decision but it doesn't mean that colleges aren't benefiting in the process. All of the institutional motives, for adopting a test optional policy still remain, whether we're in the middle of a pandemic or not.
Right, right. Yeah, it seems like it's, 2019 was the biggest year for test optional schools to jump on the bandwagon.
Mhm.
And this year, I think it's going to blow that
Yeah,
out of the
it will, and it's going to be interesting to see which institutions actually hold on to their test optional policies. McAllister came out, I think a few weeks ago, saying that we're not just making tests optional for this cycle, it's for all subsequent cycles as well. And I do think it's an opportunity for colleges to really evaluate what going test optional does to their admissions process, the makeup of their incoming student body, how they're perceived, how they're ranked. So it's an exciting time for test optional advocates, no doubt, but we'll have to see kind of how this all plays out.
Right, right. Yeah. And I guess some schools, I mean, can you think of some off the top of your head that just say, oh, it's just for the next admission cycle, or, oh, 3 years, that's it?
Yeah, to my knowledge, I believe some very selective schools, we're looking at like Pomona, Claremont McKenna, I believe Cornell as well. And we see this herd mentality, right? So, Pomona, made their tests optional in early April. Claremont McKenna followed suit. The UC system, they made tests optional in early April. University of Washington followed suit. So I think a lot of these colleges now are getting a look at their competitors. If your competitor is doing this and you believe that they're going to draw more applicants to their institution as a result, you're certainly more inclined to consider adopting that policy yourself.
Right. And I just think there could be a tipping point, especially with the University of California, which, the College Board has always been super concerned about, like, oh, we got to keep
they should be, for sure.
Yeah. And, with the subject test and then the SAT itself. I mean, I can't imagine that the University of California system is ever going to go back to taking tests again. I just can't imagine.
It remains to be seen. I know they were considering going test optional before all of this happened. Ultimately, they decided against instituting the policy, but circumstances changed, and then their decision-making process changed as a result. But it will be very interesting to see. And you're right. I mean, the College Board certainly doesn't like this to happen. How many applicants submit to the University of California system? Right. Thousands upon thousands. So it certainly can make a dent in their business for sure.
Oh yeah, they're a nonprofit, but they make billions. Like
that's right. Exactly. Yep. Same goes for the ACT.
Yeah. Another thing maybe you could talk about just why, like UCs, like there was that issue of, oh, should we even use them anymore? It's because, could you talk about it's really discriminatory in terms of some kids,
Yeah. Right. I mean, absolutely. So you're seeing this with it's not just test scores, it's with everything. It's with, essay writing, it's with building an extracurricular profile. Disadvantaged, less affluent students don't have access to the opportunities and the preparation they need to perform as well as their more affluent peers. So I think colleges are right to investigate this. It can be something that at the end of the day really does improve access, but I suspect that test optional policies alone are not going to prove sufficient. There's other things that are equally important. Tuition, financial aid. A lot of these disadvantaged students may submit an application, but at the end of the day, if they don't get sufficient financial aid, they're not going anyway. And then your goal of actually improving diversity on campus, improving access to those institutions goes out the window. So this shouldn't be just test optional and nothing else. We should be looking at implementing test optional in conjunction with other policies that really do provide for greater access. And some schools have been doing that. Some schools haven't. And it kind of relates to the argument, I think, that some of these test optional advocates make, is that, oh, if we were just to eliminate standardized test score requirements, we would see this dramatic jump in enrollment among underrepresented and disadvantaged students. And unfortunately, there hasn't been a lot of research done in this area. I believe our study is the only study to be conducted that actually incorporates rigorous methodology. Some of these other studies that you see coming out of, Bates had a study down in Wake Forest, there was one. They're very descriptive. They focus on one institution. They don't incorporate adequate controls. It's just not something that, policymakers should be relying on or administrators should be relying on when deciding whether or not to go test optional.
Right. And I guess one of the things that I was always kind of blown my mind about the test is, how it's correlated with income. So, and it's not just low income kids, like a family that, you know, household income is 200,000, right? The kids on average do better than the kids whose families make $150,000 a year.
Sure.
And they do better than the $100,000. So it's not just low income kids. It's like, how rich are your parents? You know?
And it makes sense, right? So like I may be making $100,000, but I may not have the discretionary income available to me to shell out a couple $1,000s on test prep. Whereas if I'm in that category of families earning $200,000 or more, that becomes more realistic for me, more doable.
Yeah. And another thing that you're talking about, you know, your research and how it's different from others. One of the things I thought was interesting is you not only saw that, you know, it wasn't in your study that just there wasn't more diversity on the campuses after this policy was implemented, but who it really seemed to benefit were high income kids with lousy test scores.
Right. And they're typically, you know, our study didn't necessarily find for that population, but you can kind of, you know, conclude that if, you know, they're not drawing more diverse students to campus, then who are they drawing? You know, what do these test optional students really look like? And that makes sense because those more affluent, more advantaged students might be more savvy when it comes to navigating the application process. They have a parent who went through the process. They have better access to school counseling, maybe better access to certain higher education related information that is just more prevalent in their household. There are a lot of test optional or potential test optional applicants that don't even know they have an opportunity to apply to the University of Chicago without submitting their test scores, or to some of these great liberal arts colleges. Some of these less affluent students don't realize that going to a liberal arts college is actually a possibility with financial aid. So it's not just tuition, not just financial aid, it's better access to information. How do we reach those low income and or underserved students to make them more aware of the options that are available to them after high school?
And I guess and one other thing about that is, you know, colleges like what they call full pay students, right? They like higher income kids. That's what they love. It's a shrinking pool, you know,
Yes.
but they would look more desirable if the kids who had higher income, but, you know, mediocre scores, you could just push those scores aside, then they look really good, right? Much more attractive.
Absolutely. And that's why you see some of these schools throw money at these students, even if their profiles are lower than average, because paying $50,000 for a $70,000 education is better than paying nothing or $5,000. And you know, in the work that we do work admittedly with many affluent students, and we see this play out in their admissions decisions. And really in sharp contrast to when I was working as a school counselor, aiding a lot of low-income students. Some of the breaks that these more affluent students enjoy are not given to some of those other students that fall outside of that group.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. And then I guess we should mention where you can find the list of of test optional schools.
Yeah, so FairTest.org does a good job of not only publishing test optional schools ranked in I believe the top 100 or top 150 of all universities and liberal arts colleges. They also have a cool feature or a cool document on their page, kind of running through the chronology of when these schools adopted.
I could just let me go do that. Let's go to FairTest. Oh, I have to put my share my screen. Hold on.
No worries.
Let's see. It's worth it, folks. Just be patient. Okay. Where did okay, my messy desktop. So this is fairtest.org, and you can go to the searchable. And these people, it's a nonprofit. They do not like standardized tests, and they actually have been advocating to drop these tests for years, and they work with colleges who decide, yeah, I think I want to do that. But right now, over 1,160 schools have test optional policies.
Yeah, some of the advocacy work they do is great. Their ability to cite research is less impressive. I believe the founder, I think his name is Bob Schieffer, has gone on the record critiquing certain studies, and he's just really not in a position, or he doesn't really have the background to be doing that. He called out our study a couple of years ago citing problems that weren't in fact problems if he was familiar with the methodology himself.
Right.
And we had a back and forth, and I just encouraged him. You don't want to discount the good work I think that some of these organizations are doing. I think at the end of the day, their hearts are in the right place. They want to increase access. That's great, but I think they need to be responsible, and they need to, prioritize some of this more rigorous research. And the data is there now. I mean, a lot of these colleges are adopting test optional policies. It's not as if these studies can't be done, but for some reason they just haven't appeared in the literature. So I hope, and I know my colleagues hope, that there are more researchers that start to take on this kind of work, because it is a question that needs to be answered. We don't know if test optional policies do in fact improve diversity at some of these other institution types, like research universities, for example.
I think it's just been a hot potato, right? Like schools don't want to really know what's going on. I mean, want people to know if that is in fact the case, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah, and you want to know as an administrator. I mean, you may have genuine desire to enroll different types of students. You can't make that decision without good research.
Right. Well, this website's super slow, so I'm not, but I'll show you. I just, you can click on the database and then you can
and
go
there's a
through
PDF right there, Lynn, if you
yeah,
go
but
up.
it's this one. I try to, it's 460 test options. This is what I use, but it's not loaded. So that's the first time this is never not loaded, but oh, here we go. But they've been updating this almost every day because schools have been adding to it. So it has a list of, sorry, it's not calling up, but it has a list of liberal arts colleges. It has a test optional, has a list of national university colleges, regional universities. And of course, I guess we should mention that there are more liberal arts colleges versus national universities that do this. The national universities still don't feel like, one, they feel like they need that metric, and they're not as necessarily holistic.
Right, they don't have the luxury maybe of really diving into those applications because maybe they have less admissions officers per applicant. So yeah, you're going to see a lot of these universities adopt more formula-driven admissions processes for sure.
Yeah. Okay, so anyway, I think that's probably, do you have anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I think just in terms of what's going on now, I think it's really important for students, again, I may have made this point earlier, to still consider taking those standardized exams. I think high test results are going to be in short supply this year because, as I said, a lot of students are opting out. There aren't as many testing opportunities. So you may see a lot of these institutions that really relax their admission standards or throw out a lot of money to students who can really achieve high scores on those results. So even if you don't submit those results, and you don't have to in many of these institutions, it's still worth devoting some time over the summer and the fall to prepping for those exams.
And what do you think about, now I guess the ACT today just came out, and this is May 5th, came out that they say they're going to hold the June and July ones.
We'll see. I mean, as a parent myself, like I don't know if I want, my child going into a high school with 300 other students. We'll have to see. I mean,
my kid. And what schools are going to be open to have the tests?
I mean, every week seems like a year. So like something that's happening this week, doesn't necessarily predict what's going to happen, 2 weeks out. So there still probably is time to change course. And then if June or July are canceled, we've already seen the College Board institute a number of other dates within the fall, also talk about going virtual. So I'm hopeful there'll be opportunities, but June and July is tough. We just don't know yet.
And I'm also wondering, because for people who might, take that online test at home, I mean, the ACT, they're definitely going to have it. The College Board for the SAT says, well, if we need it, we're definitely going to offer it. We're developing it. Is there any way people can, I mean, how do kids study, or,
what if I only have access to a mobile phone? I mean, what if I can't find a quiet room? What if my internet connection is bad? There's so many potential difficulties and problems, which is why I think, as I mentioned, universities going test optional for this year is probably a good move. It's just really hard to account for all those things to really give every student equal opportunity to do well in this.
Right, and then you wouldn't be used to taking tests on. I guess they are going to have some kind of opportunity to maybe practice before on a computer before the test. I don't know, but it just seems a little
I think they're
iffy.
doing their best, right? But at the end of the day, their best may not be good enough.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. So anything else, Andrew, or
I think that's it. I really appreciate the opportunity to come in and talk with you, and then hopefully your listeners and your readers find this helpful as well.
Oh yeah. Well, I thought of you when I think of test optional. I think of
Right.
you and your unique research. I agree with you. I wish more people would be researchers would be used doing this, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
I thank you so much and for all your valuable information, and I know everybody's going to
No
benefit.
worries at all. No worries. Thanks so much, Lynn, for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Here, thank you.
All right. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.